Randomized for inviting me and giving you a talk about donor milk banking, safety, efficacy, new methodologies. If you type these expression donor milk banking new into PubMed, the following hotspots show up: COVID burden on human milk business and safe donor human milk supply, new aspects on pasteurization procedures, other safety aspects like drug and donor screening, and nutrient variability of donor milk, impact on development and ways out like target fortification, disclosure, labeling of nutritional content of batches. So let me lead you through this agenda. What do we know about perinatal transmission of SARS-CoV-2? Because I think we should not have this talk without having a quick look at what's going on there for donor human milk and human milk banks. So the in utero vertical transmission remains unproven. And transmission of SARS-CoV-2 due to vaginal birth appears unlikely. Experience with other respiratory viruses indicated it was unlikely that SARS-CoV-2 would be transmitted via breast milk. There's no evidence of viable infective SARS-CoV-2 in human milk. On the other hand, there is presence of SARS-CoV-2 specific immunoglobulin in infected mother's milk, which might be good for the baby. Already early in March 2020, low rates of serious illness in SARS-CoV-2 infants were already suggested by the evidence. And isolating infants from COVID mothers and prohibiting breastfeeding was not associated with less postpartum virus transmission than with permitted breastfeeding plus appropriate infection prevention and control measures. So WHO says in infants the risk of COVID-19 infection is low. The infection is typically mild or asymptomatic, and the consequences of not breastfeeding or separation of mother and child can be significant. So what has been recommended by the WHO is that not to have a change of practice. And this is important if you look here into point number 4, 5, and 6 about direct breastfeeding, provision of express breast milk, and provision of donor human milk. But what has been done in reality is different. There's poor adherence to the WHO COVID guidelines regarding mother-newborn care and breastfeeding or donor milk. And this has been shown in this paper by this group, where they compared in 33 countries national guidelines against the WHO recommendations. And this is what has been found. The degree of deviation from WHO recommendations does not correlate with infant mortality rate or economic power, as shown here for these different groups of countries. You see the green ones are those who adhere to the WHO with high points, and the red ones are those that don't. You see there is no difference between the different groups, so it's a very, very inhomogeneous picture. And especially in detail for mother-infant proximity and rooming in, there's also low adherence to the WHO recommendations as indicated here. Only 36 or 33% for confirmed and suspected cases recommend rooming in. With respect to donor human milk access, it is even worse. Only 12% in confirmed COVID and 9% in suspected COVID recommended the use of donor human milk. The good thing is expressed breast milk from the own mother was still recommended, but also here 12% and 9% was not recommended. So this overall suggests decreasing donor milk demand. Now let's see what other reports say about the donor milk supply, because they identified pandemic control measures as roadblocks for this supply, like in this paper, where deferral of donors for 28 days was started in case of COVID-19 history, despite the different evidence. This paper is very interesting. It is from the Virtual Communication Network that grouped information from 35 countries from milk banks. It's a multi-author and it's an illustrative narrative review and has identified 7 pandemic-related vulnerabilities in service provision. And let me lead you through a few points that they found, because I find them very interesting. So it's about donor milk, human milk availability. So some legislations found increased donor human milk demand for babies from COVID mothers because they were put into quarantine against mothers on milk. That's why they needed donor milk. On the other hand, there were reports about decreased demand because there was lack of evidence in the and about the dissemination that SARS-CoV-2 could be inactivated by pasteurization. And there were other reports about decreased supply because outside hospital donations were shut down to avoid overcrowding. There was reduced donor numbers because of fear leaving the house, avoid hospital visits, and there was also difficult access to test centers and phlebotomy services. And in some areas, basic transport infrastructures were closed, like the ferry network in British Columbia or air freight services in areas where milk banks serve large geographical areas. There was also milk quarantine principle installed, which means that the pasteurized milk was first frozen for the first 14 days and only released after reassurance by phone that the donor mothers were kept symptom-free for 14 to 28 days. There were other reports about decreased donation and increased demand. This paper here shows that there was donor milk increased. The median raw milk donated per month was 63 before, and after the pandemic, it was 111, 106, and 91 liters. And our own personal observation is that percentage of mothers on milk, nursing mothers, it was increased as there was less distraction and disruption from mother and newborn pairs. Other than the father, nobody was allowed to come in, and that helped with bonding and with nursing and get the milk flow up and running. So there are no data out what that means just right now. So I asked Corinna Gebauer from the Milk Bank in Leipzig, which is the largest one in Germany. And thanks to her, she provided me with this very actual data here. What you see here, 2019, 2020, 2021 per month. This is the influx, this is the outflux. Here are the lockdown periods, and I grouped these here together because it never really came out there. So at the end, you see that the amount of milk coming into the human milk bank decreased over time, and whereas the demand was still the same. So these are the only numbers that I know, so there is some impact on donor milk supply. So in summary, there's low evidence that there's increased health risk on human milk banks business due to COVID-19, but it's a huge organizational burden with personal protection equipment, social distancing, and that might also impact people to donate. There are discrepant reports on human milk bank performance between demands and supply, increased, decreased. We find everything, so the chapter is not closed yet. So far, the update about COVID. So now about new technology, and here I would like to talk about pasteurization, but there's not a lot to talk about. The good thing is that we know now that Holder pasteurization inactivates SARS-CoV-2, but that was all done in spiked breast milk samples because there were no infective agents found in breast milk. And interestingly, in this paper, they also found Holder pasteurization was okay, but not cold storage. So having the milk stored at +4 or -30 degrees at 48 hours does not reduce the viral load or the ability to replicate. Now, this here is the classical Holder pasteurization that most of us might be using. Are there other ways to use it, to do it? Because there's lots of research going on now. Basically, what we have apart from this Holder, which is a low temperature, long-term pasteurization, we have a high temperature, short-term pasteurization, HTST. We have a high pressure pasteurization, which uses 500 megapascal, which is 10,000 times higher than our atmospheric pressure, and ultraviolet C irradiation. And due to time, I cannot go into all details, but here you see this is high temperature, short term, this is high pressure, and you see these are big units, looks a little bit like Star Wars, and they cannot be used in daily routine in human milk banks. It's more for industrial purposes, and they need to be scaled down. And actually in Poland, they are trying to build a smaller unit that can be used in a human milk bank. This is very fascinating, the ultraviolet C, which works beautifully, but there's still a lot of work to do to make it work in current practice. This is a new paper from 2019 where 4 different measures, Holder pasteurization, UVC, high pressure pasteurization, and the flash heat pasteurization were compared in terms of elimination of germs, but also in preserving biofactors. And you see here that the high pressure is the most promising one. It keeps breast milk mostly unchanged, but kills the germs. Now, if you look at the different things the different features that you need to get with pasteurization and the different devices that I showed to you, then you can see that here for the high temperature, short-term UVC and high pressure, that there's still a lot of question marks or minuses. So for now, I can say we still stay with the Holder pasteurization, and there's so far nothing new, but the most promising one is maybe HPP and UVC. There's another good paper that came out and looked into freeze drying, so lyophilization to make human milk more durable. And you see here that it conserves biofactors very nicely here compared to others. And there is no growth of test strains in freeze-dried breast milk within 6 months of storage, what you see here compared to the raw milk. So it's a promising tool. So overall, for this part, best evidence is still available for the classical Holder method, still a good compromise in standard clinical setting procedures. And HST and HHP are two new high-tech methods with promising with respect to conserving biofactors, but they need more data and more research. And the technology of UVC irradiation seems to be appealing with respect to simplicity, efficiency, potential availability, and costs, and should be investigated further. And lyophilization may allow safe and easy storage. So now let's quickly go to safety and donor human milk. It's quick intermezzo. Basically, this is a super great paper by Ben Hartman's group, by him and his group, looking into safety in donor human milk bank in neonatal intensive care. And it's a very thoughtful paper. And you see here just two tables on general donor assessment or donor medical and surgical interventions. And here are the different different points in potential hazard, and here's comments on it and the references. And he didn't do it only for these two areas, but he did it for another 14 areas. So it's a super great paper in case that you are planning to open up a milk bank, worthwhile reading. So this is something that interested me quite for a while, so I thought I'd put it into this talk, is what does extended milk screening add with respect to safety? And with extended milk screening, I mean proteins, chemical contaminants, some illegal drugs, prescription drugs, or whether the donated milk was diluted or whether animal milk was mixed in it. Obviously, this is maybe more if you are a pay-per-performance milk bank, maybe more than if it's a milk bank that is truly voluntary. But let's have a look into the data. There's only one paper out from Barry Bloom from Wichita from the US, and he compared non-remunerated versus remunerated donor milk bank services. This is a screening survey, what everybody does about did you do this, did you have this, and so on. Not a big difference in terms of exclusion, what led to exclusion. Infection screening is the same thing here, not a big difference, maybe a small difference here in HIV, but that's why it's being screened, and that's part of the normal routine. This is DNA matching to see whether there are more than one donor in there, which is interesting because it's in the non-remunerated where they found 2. And drug screening also no difference. It was cotinine, so basically they didn't disclose smoking, and here there was drug use maybe against pain. What was a difference was here adulteration by dilution. The pay for performance or for profit had a higher number of dilution compared to the other ones. So this leads to 2%, and overall, otherwise there's no big difference. So there's a small additional benefit, but at high costs and processing time, and it affects overall 1 to 2% of all tested samples. Now let's go to efficacy. Talking about donor milk, I would focus here on the negative parts of donor milk because we know very well about the positive parts. The negative is that macronutrient content is variable and not balanced for preterm babies. Protein is too low for preemies, and the content is even lower due to late lactation. We do pasteurization and other handling procedures that affects the quality. So overall, it's now very well known that donor milk has an inbuilt risk of providing insufficient nutrient intake, as found out in this Cochrane database. And it's mainly due to that the protein content is falling down during lactation. And it's not at 1.5, where most standard fortifiers were calculating with. It's closer to 1, as you can see here. On top, we do handling with donor milk. And the more times you handle milk, the more nutrients you lose, fat and protein. And this is now coming, the good thing is it's coming now into the conscious of the neonatal society. You see here 2 more papers from recent years that say donor human milk use is also associated with inferior in hospital preterm infant growth compared with preterm formula and maternal milk. And in this paper, it's said in a similar way. And in this paper here from 2017 from Tufts, they compared donor milk, mother's own milk, and preterm formula and neurodevelopmental outcome, and it was highest for preterm babies and then for mother's own milk, and then there was a big difference to donor human milk. So these infants also grew more poorly in the first months of life than those fed mother's milk or preterm formula. And that might be also the clue why the Domino trial might not have found a difference in neurodevelopmental outcome, but though there was a big difference in necrotizing enterocolitis and also in sepsis. The reason might have been that, let's have a look into it. Donor milk, there were 151 babies on it. 3 babies had a necrotizing enterocolitis. In preterm, there were 148 babies included and 10 had a necrotizing enterocolitis. So let's assume that the delta IQ between neck and non-neck cases is about 25 points per child, which is not unreasonable with shortcut, with continuous inflammation and so on. And the difference between donor milk and preterm formula because of poorer growth is only 2 points per child. Then we have a neck positive effect of -7 neck cases times 25, so a plus of 175 points in the donor milk group, and we have a negative effect of 148 donor milk babies -2, 296. So the donor milk overall collects less IQ points. Now you would say, yeah, but the study did not find differences in growth, and I would address that this way. Let's take the Stevens data of 8.2 MDI points per 1 gram per kilogram, 1 gram protein per kilogram per day. Then you will see that a delta MDI of 2 corresponds to a difference of intake of 0.24 gram protein per kilogram per day. This 0.2 4 gram protein per kilogram per day then lead to a difference in growth rate of 1.5 gram per kilogram per day if we take the Michele or Embleton data. And the Domino trial was not powered two-tailed to detect differences in growth rates as low as 1 to 2 gram per kilogram. Keep in mind that the delta P content of donor milk versus mother's milk is in the area of 0.3 to 0.5 gram. So that's really a reasonable approach and at least ways to think about it if we take also all the other data together. Now, can you change it? There is the Madrid experience with a personalized nutrition unit, and what they did here, they had a focus to obtain more appropriate donor milk for the NICU high-risk infant, and they had a program that they run from 2018 to 2020, where 280 donors given about 150 preterm babies milk. And the donor milk was matched according to gestational age and stage of lactation. There was no pooling of different donors to keep traceability of the milk. And then they did target fortification based on macronutrient content analysis. They found a clear difference in total protein content by gestational age and lactation. And this were also present for fat. There was a reduction of necrotizing enterocolitis and late onset, which was significant. And they found better growth during hospitalization. Unfortunately, they don't disclose any data. Now, this paper from Marianne Perrin looked into different ways of pooling data from batches from a milk bank. These are the raw data of all the batches. This is a distribution that we know that has been published by many people, including ourselves. And this here is where they come up with for protein and for fat if they do different kind of pooling procedures or targeted procedure or targeted pooling, which needs prior knowledge about the protein and fat content. And then you see here that the number of pools that are above a certain limit increases, or the number below decreases for both. So these different pooling ways are efficient in creating breast milk of better, or donor milk of better quality. We did a similar study with larger numbers, and we also did look into different schedules. That's actually in revision, so I don't want to show you the data just right now. And at the end, I would like to draw your attention to the randomized control trial target fortification, where we try to improve the nutrient intake according to the Espegan recommendations. I don't want to go into this trial in detail. The only thing I want to show you here is this is standard fortification. This is target fortification. These little dots here, the black ones, are donor milk. And you see here that protein content of donor milk is usually below average. It's the same for carbohydrates, but not for fat. And if we do standard fortification in both groups, we don't change it, but we change it when we do target fortification. You see here that donor milk is somewhere in between, so we don't have the donor milk on the lower end. And that's why babies then grow better, and maybe you have a better outcome in terms of neurodevelopmental outcome. This is how our babies grow, just as one example. Yeah, it's a beautiful example, but many of our babies do it this way with what we are doing. This is a little comparison of before and after target fortification versus the target growth trajectories, and you see that it makes a huge difference also with these are our babies on donor milk. So the last question is, should macronutrient content of donor milk be disclosed or labeled? This here is a recent paper from New Zealand, and they said the variance in individual pooled donor human milk indicates the importance of determining the nutrient composition of donated milk to inform fortification procedures. So that means that the most reasonable answer, should it be disclosed, maybe yes, and the guys in Poland are doing it in all their milk banks. So come to the summary. Milk banks should measure the macronutrient content of their batches, improve pooling algorithms, and disclose the nutrient content of provided donor milk to the unit customer. Certain types of donor pooling may help with avoiding macronutrient depleted donor milk. In the meantime, additional supplementation using 0.3 to 0.5 gram protein per 100 milliliters seems to be reasonable, like suggested from Karen Zimmer's group. Adjusted fortification may help to improve growth, but is not efficient in all preterm infants. Data about NDI are not available. Data from our double-blind RCT show that target fortification improves growth compared to standard fortification, most likely including NDI. It's kind of precision medicine. This is confirmed by other recently published studies. More research and clinical studies are needed, and I'm happy to hear Chris's talk, which will follow now. Thank you very much for your attention.